Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something utterly bizarre. Medieval kings and their wildly strange eating habits. Picture this. Grand feasts with endless platters, lavish banquets that lasted for days, and dishes that would make you question whether anyone really wanted to survive that meal. Yeah, we're talking about the era of royal excess where the dining table was not just for food, but for showing off status, power, and just maybe a bit of eccentricity. Imagine a banquet hall, candles flickering in the dim light, as rich aromas fill the air, spiced meats, wine flowing like a river, and a lineup of dishes you wouldn't even dare to try. Kings weren't just hungry, they were royally hungry, and they made sure everyone knew it. But what drove them to such extremes? Sure, it was all about luxury and indulgence, but there were deeper layers to their odd eating choices, health beliefs, superstitions, and a whole lot of what can we afford next? You probably won't survive these royal meals, but let's explore how the medieval king's dining habits could make even a modern-day food critic raise an eyebrow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to post your location and local time in the comments too. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now let's head to those royal banquets. These were no ordinary dinners. Imagine feasts that lasted for hours, with food served in courses that seemed endless. The very idea of a banquet wasn't just about eating, it was a visual spectacle, a performance, and a statement. The tables were laden with so much food that it seemed to spill over, as if they were trying to show their wealth and power with every bite. Historians still argue about the sheer volume of food consumed at these events. Some say it was about consumption. Others argue it was about creating the illusion of abundance to awe the guests. Either way, food wasn't just food, it was an extravagant display of riches. Dishes like roasted meats, exotic birds, and even pies filled with live birds were served. Yes, you heard that right, pies that when cut open would release a flurry of live birds. It was all about spectacle. But it wasn't just the food that was the star of the show. The location itself, massive banquet halls, often decorated with tapestries and elaborate furnishings, was a huge part of the royal dining experience. It wasn't uncommon for kings to spend days preparing for these feasts. For them, it wasn't just about eating, it was about showing off their power, their wealth, and their ability to indulge without restraint. However, beyond the power play, food at these banquets was also closely tied to what the royal courts believed about health and nourishment. Some dishes were considered medicinal, not because they were healthy, but because it was believed they could cure ailments or provide protection. So you might see a royal dinner table lined not only with meats and breads but also with strange concoctions, herbal potions, stews that contained obscure ingredients, and desserts that were as much about superstition as they were about taste. But let's get into the more bizarre stuff. Peacock tongues? Boiled camel? Yes, these were not just on the menu, they were highlighted parts of the royal banquet. The fact that these dishes were a part of the medieval royal feast makes us wonder. Why on earth would anyone eat this? Historians still debate whether it was a genuine belief in the medicinal properties of these animals or if it was all about flexing power by consuming the exotic and rare. Now, imagine being a guest at one of these royal banquets. You might feel a mix of awe, envy, and, let's be honest, discomfort. The idea of eating such bizarre dishes, knowing the king would probably be watching you eat it, must have been terrifying. But for the royalty, it wasn't just about the food. It was a display of control over nature and society. By eating the most unusual and sometimes revolting things, kings were sending a message: I control this feast and I can afford anything. But, as you can probably guess, indulging in such excess didn't always have the healthiest consequences. Sure, they might have had access to the finest ingredients of the time, but kings who lived like this often found themselves facing some unpleasant health issues. The constant feasting took its toll on their bodies, ranging from obesity to gout, and some even dealt with the physical effects of overeating, which might have influenced their ability to lead effectively. Talk about a royal pain. But here's the kicker. Despite their indulgence, many of these kings actually believed they were eating to stay healthy. They had superstitions about certain foods that were supposed to protect them from illnesses or give them strength. That's right. Foods like almonds, honey, and even wine were thought to boost health and vitality, though modern science may disagree with their logic. So, why were these royals so obsessed with food that seemed to defy all logic? Historians still debate the exact motivations. Was it vanity? Was it a genuine belief in the healing properties of these dishes? Or were these habits part of a larger cultural trend where food wasn't just about eating, it was about surviving and thriving in a world full of superstitions? Now that we've gotten a glimpse into the grandeur of medieval royal banquets, let's take a deeper dive into what went into making these feasts so extravagant. The king's table wasn't just a place to eat, it was a performance. It was as much about the spectacle as it was about the food. Imagine a grand hall filled with long wooden tables, the flicker of candlelight casting shadows across the walls as noble guests from distant lands reclined on cushioned benches, eagerly awaiting the spread of food that was about to be laid before them. Each course was more elaborate than the last, creating a sense of endless abundance that was intended to astound everyone present. The sheer volume of food on the tables made it seem as though the wealth of the kingdom was overflowing, and these feasts became a way for kings to demonstrate their power and generosity to their subjects and foreign dignitaries alike. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a tool to control perceptions and showcase the royal family's might. Historians still argue whether the endless servings of food were driven by a desire for abundance or whether it was simply a method to impress and humble anyone who might dare to question the king's rule. The illusion of wealth was as important as the wealth itself. It was said that the larger the feast, the greater the king's stature in the eyes of his people. More food meant more power, and it was this mindset that led to lavish and often wasteful displays of indulgence. Now, let's talk about some of the less-than-ordinary dishes that made their way to the king's table. These weren't just meals, they were strange and often absurd concoctions designed to surprise and impress. Take boiled camel for instance. That's right. Some kings would serve entire camels boiled in their entirety including the organs. The idea was that by cooking such a majestic and rare animal, they could demonstrate their dominance over nature itself. But what about peacock tongues? Surely you must be wondering why anyone would want to eat a bird's tongue. Well, it was considered a delicacy prized not just for its rarity, but for its supposed health benefits. The rich and eccentric flavors were said to have been coveted by kings who wanted to display their control over their domain, both in terms of power and culinary taste. Historians debate why exactly these particular foods were so prized. Was it because they were exotic? Or was it because they were so difficult to obtain, making them a symbol of the king's superior wealth and access to resources? It's likely a mix of both, but one thing is clear. These foods were not just about satisfying hunger. They were a statement, a way for the royals to assert their dominance over the world around them. Every dish was a way of saying, I have the power to bring you anything, no matter how strange or rare. As for the medicinal aspect of these foods, there was also a belief among medieval kings that certain exotic animals and rare ingredients possessed healing properties. The consumption of these dishes wasn't just about luxury, it was about protection. Monarchs were often plagued by the fear of poisoning, and many believed that by consuming unusual foods, they could either ward off potential poisons or increase their vitality. Some even thought that by eating rare birds or exotic meats, they were fortifying themselves against illness. It was all about prevention, and what better way to prevent harm than to consume the rarest, most sought-after foods in the world? Now let's shift gears and take a look at how these feasts were not only about indulgence, but also about forming and reinforcing alliances. Kings used food as a bargaining chip. Feasting together wasn't just about sharing a meal, it was about strengthening ties and establishing bonds between powerful families and foreign dignitaries. When a king invited another monarch to a feast, it was often a diplomatic gesture, meant to ensure loyalty or smooth over tensions. A well-fed guest was more likely to feel indebted to the host, and that was a subtle yet effective form of political leverage. The feasts were so ingrained in the fabric of medieval society that no royal gathering was complete without one. Whether it was to celebrate a victory in battle, commemorate a royal birth, or simply mark the passage of time, feasts were the highlight of the king's calendar. But even as they indulged in extravagant meals, the knowledge that these feasts could be political tools or opportunities for power was never far from the minds of the guests. Every bite could be a step toward securing a political advantage, and no one was more aware of this than the kings themselves. Interestingly, historians still debate whether the feasting culture was a sign of a flourishing society or a symptom of a deeper issue. Was it a necessary part of royal life, allowing kings to demonstrate their power and wealth, or was it a sign of excess that eventually led to the downfall of many monarchs? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, with these grand banquets acting as both a source of pride and a dangerous excess that could have long-term consequences. As we move forward in this story, we'll explore how these excessive habits didn't just affect the image of royalty, they began to have a real impact on the health of the kings themselves. Now, while royal banquets were a spectacle of wealth, power, and culinary eccentricities, there was a darker side to this excess: health consequences. The very indulgence that made kings appear invincible could also leave them vulnerable. You see, all those rich meats, lavish desserts, and endless goblets of wine came at a cost. While kings and their courts reveled in the abundance before them, they often neglected the toll that such extravagance took on their bodies. In medieval times, kings weren't just fighting off battles. They were battling their own health issues. Some of the most famous kings, like King Henry VIII, were known for their obesity, and their unhealthy eating habits contributed to their physical decline. Historians still argue about the role food played in their health problems, but one thing's for certain: many of them ate themselves into poor health. Overindulgence led to serious consequences like gout, diabetes, and even heart problems, not to mention digestive issues caused by the rich, fatty foods they consumed regularly. The lavish feasts that made them appear godlike to their subjects were actually taking a quiet toll on their royal bodies. Let's take Henry VIII as an example. Known for his insatiable appetite and love for rich foods, his meals often included massive portions of meat, pastries, and wine. In fact, during one banquet, it's said that he could consume up to 6 full courses, with each one more extravagant than the last. However, this lifestyle ultimately caught up with him. By the time Henry reached his 40s, he was already showing signs of serious health problems. He was morbidly obese, suffered from chronic pain, and dealt with the consequences of a poor diet, including frequent bouts of gout. Historians argue whether Henry's diet directly led to his various ailments, but it's clear that the culture of excess wasn't doing him any favors. And it wasn't just Henry. Many kings and queens of the medieval era struggled with obesity, and it was often the result of a royal lifestyle that valued indulgence over moderation. The availability of rich foods, combined with the lack of knowledge about nutrition and exercise, meant that many royal families were prone to overeating. The idea that food was a status symbol, something to be consumed lavishly and excessively, became deeply ingrained in the royal mindset. But the result was often poor health, and the visible toll of excessiveness became evident in the appearance and health of many rulers. Of course, kings weren't entirely unaware of the consequences of their eating habits. Some turned to medicinal foods as a solution to their problems. Certain herbs, spices, and remedies were believed to cleanse the body, rid it of toxins, or restore energy. But these remedies weren't always effective, and many were based on misconceptions about how food could influence health. For instance, medieval kings often turned to spiced wine to purify their bodies. These wines, infused with herbs and spices like cinnamon, cloves, and saffron, were thought to cure everything from indigestion to depression. Of course, we know now that while these spices may have had some medicinal properties, they weren't exactly a cure-all. Still, it's fascinating to think that the rich and powerful believed such concoctions could solve their problems, even as their diets and lifestyles were leading them down a path of poor health. Interestingly, there were some kings who understood the importance of moderation. They may have indulged in luxurious foods, but they also took steps to balance their diets with more wholesome meals. Some medieval monarchs were even known to adopt fasting as a way to cleanse the body, often using it as a form of self-discipline. Fasting became a method of purging toxins and controlling overindulgence. But as we'll see later, fasting was also tied to religion, and the church had a significant influence on what kings could and could not eat, especially during certain times of the year. At the same time, there were always those who pushed the boundaries of excess. These were the kings who, despite suffering from the consequences of their indulgence, continued to eat and drink with abandon, often refusing to listen to medical advice or the pleas of their advisors. Some royal courts even employed doctors whose sole purpose was to prescribe food remedies. But with all the best intentions, these doctors couldn't always reverse the damage that had already been done by years of overconsumption. Historians still debate whether these unhealthy habits were a reflection of a culture that truly valued indulgence or if they were a symptom of deeper societal problems. Was the royal obsession with food just a byproduct of living in a world where they could afford anything, or was it a deeper need to exert control over the one thing that was universally accessible, food? Some historians even argue that these kings' insatiable appetites were a reflection of the instability of their times, where their only way to cope with external pressures was through excess. One thing is clear though, medieval kings didn't just live to eat, they ate to live, often at the expense of their own well-being. And as we move forward in our journey tonight, we'll take a closer look at the ways these monarchs dealt with the fear of poisoning, and how food, once again, became a tool in the game of royal power and survival. Now, let's take a fascinating turn into a deeply ingrained fear that gripped many of these medieval monarchs: poisoning. The court of a medieval king was a hotbed of conspiracy, betrayal, and intrigue, and what better way to exert control or eliminate an enemy than through the silent weapon of poison? The fear of being poisoned was so pervasive that it shaped the food habits of kings and queens for centuries. In fact, for many of them, the fear of a poisoned meal was as real as the fear of being overthrown in battle. Royal dining tables, which were meant to be symbols of grandeur and indulgence, were also scenes of deep suspicion. Kings often hired food tasters who would sample the dishes before the monarch took a bite, ensuring that no one had slipped poison into their meal. Historians still debate how widespread the fear of poisoning actually was. Some argue that it was more paranoia than reality, while others suggest that medieval kings had very real reasons to be wary. After all, throughout history, poison had been a favored method of assassination, especially among political rivals who needed a quick, discreet way of removing an opponent. For many rulers, food became a tool of survival, a way to test loyalty and a way to protect themselves. Some even went so far as to take certain precautions with the types of food they consumed. Take the case of King Louis XIV of France, for instance. It's said that his court developed a method of boiling their wine in order to purify it and remove any potential poison. This practice, of course, was based on little more than superstition, but the fear was real. Kings didn't just trust their food, they saw it as a potential weapon that could be used against them. Interestingly, the notion of food being used as a weapon wasn't exclusive to kings and their courts. Poisons were often used in times of war and political unrest, and food was one of the easiest ways to deliver a lethal dose. The fear of poisoned meals became so ingrained that some monarchs would only trust food prepared by their most trusted chefs or, in some cases, by members of their own family. Even royal chefs were sometimes seen as potential betrayers, and their loyalty was constantly under suspicion. Some chefs were even forced to undergo sworn oaths of loyalty, swearing that they would never betray their king with poison. But not all kings were paralyzed by fear of poisoning. Some saw it as a challenge, a test of their own ability to manipulate the court. One famous example is the English King Henry IV, who was said to have used poison as a weapon against his rivals. The story goes that Henry would serve his enemies a sumptuous feast, but with a catch. He had a secret poison added to one of the dishes, and the unfortunate guest would unknowingly consume it. Henry's use of poison wasn't just about eliminating rivals. It was a way for him to demonstrate his cunning and control over life and death. Historians still argue about whether this was an effective method of eliminating threats or whether it contributed to Henry's eventual downfall. Regardless, the use of poison in the royal courts became so common that it was even romanticized in literature and folklore. The image of the poisoned chalice, or the deadly banquet, became a staple of royal intrigue, and it was impossible to escape the shadow of fear that lurked around every royal table. As you might expect, this culture of suspicion didn't just affect the rulers, it trickled down to the common folk as well. Medieval societies were rife with rumors of poisonings, and people lived in constant fear of being poisoned by their neighbors, family members, or even their closest friends. But for the kings, it was not just about personal safety, it was about maintaining power. If a king could survive assassination attempts, whether by poison or by sword, it was seen as a testament to his strength and cunning. However, as time went on, the fear of poisoning slowly gave way to a more modern understanding of food safety and hygiene. The rise of medical knowledge in the Renaissance period brought about more systematic approaches to preventing food-related illnesses. Yet, even in the face of these advancements, the legacy of the poisoned meal remained ingrained in royal culture for centuries to come. As we move forward in our story, let's explore another fascinating aspect of royal food culture: the medicinal beliefs that were often tied to the foods kings ate. Kings didn't just eat for pleasure or sustenance. They ate to heal, to ward off illness, and to increase their vitality. So what were the magical foods of the medieval court? How did kings use food as a form of medicine, and did they truly believe these strange remedies could cure them? Now, as we explore the role of food as medicine in the medieval royal courts, you might start to see a clearer picture emerge of how intertwined food and health were. For kings and queens, food wasn't just about taste or indulgence. It was often seen as a remedy for any ailment or a way to maintain strength, vitality, and youth. In fact, it was commonly believed that certain foods had magical, almost supernatural, healing powers. These medieval monarchs were quite convinced that eating the right foods could ward off illness, strengthen the body, and even lengthen their lives. Let's take a look at the most common medicinal foods that were consumed in the royal courts, some of which might sound downright strange to us today. One of the most famous examples is the use of aloe vera. Yes, the same plant you might now use for sunburns or skin irritation was thought to have powerful healing properties in medieval times. Kings were encouraged to drink potions made from aloe vera, believing that it could cure everything from digestive issues to skin problems. It wasn't just a remedy for the sick, it was part of the royal regimen to stay youthful and vital. Aloe vera was one of those plants that straddled the line between medicine and magic, revered for its supposed powers to heal and rejuvenate. Another food that was commonly used for medicinal purposes was garlic. If you've ever read a medieval text or heard a myth about healing, garlic probably came up at some point. In medieval Europe, garlic was considered a cure-all, capable of fighting off infections, boosting the immune system, and even warding off the plague. Kings and their courts were no strangers to the power of garlic, often using it in soups, stews, and medicinal potions. Some even believed that garlic could protect them from evil spirits or bad luck. As strange as it may seem, garlic was taken quite seriously as a health aid, despite the fact that its pungent smell might have been a little off-putting to many. But the food that probably tops the list of medicinal medieval royal remedies is honey. Medieval monarchs were obsessed with honey, using it not only as a sweetener but also as a powerful health tonic. It was believed to have antiseptic properties, and kings would drink it mixed with water or wine to heal wounds or cleanse their bodies of toxins. Honey was also considered to be a cure for almost anything. It was believed to prevent aging, cure fatigue, and even improve one's complexion. Imagine being a king who, after a long day of ruling, would retire to their chambers with a nice cup of honey wine. It wasn't just for pleasure, it was therapy. In fact, honey was so valued that it was often gifted to other monarchs and rulers as a symbol of wealth and health. And of course, let's not forget about spices. Medieval kitchens were full of spices that were thought to have medicinal properties. These were no mere flavor enhancers. They were viewed as powerful tools to maintain health and prevent illness. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves were believed to stimulate the digestive system, improve circulation, and even prevent colds. Kings would often drink spiced wine or eat stews filled with these ingredients, not just because they liked the taste but because they thought these spices would keep them healthy and strong. It's fascinating to think that medieval kings and queens were essentially taking superfoods long before the term was ever coined. While the belief in food as medicine might seem quaint or naive to us now, it's important to understand that during the medieval period, there wasn't much distinction between the physical and the magical. The concept of humors, the belief that the body contained four fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was central to medieval medical thought. If a person's humors were out of balance, they would become ill. And so, food played a critical role in balancing these humors. If a king felt weak, they might turn to specific foods or drinks that were thought to replenish their body and restore harmony. Interestingly, these dietary habits weren't always about personal health. They were often about maintaining the image of health. Kings couldn't afford to show weakness, especially in times of political instability. The public had to see their monarchs as strong and vital, so they used food to project that image, even if the health benefits were more myth than fact. A king who consumed rare and exotic healing foods was not just taking care of himself. He was sending a message to his subjects and enemies alike, showing that he was robust, invincible, and beyond the reach of illness. Historians still argue about how seriously these monarchs took the medicinal properties of their food. Was it just superstition, or did these foods genuinely play a role in maintaining royal health? It's hard to say. Some argue that the belief in food as medicine was merely a product of the era's limited understanding of biology and health. Others suggest that there might have been some real benefits to consuming these natural remedies, even if they weren't always as powerful as the kings thought. As we continue to unravel the relationship between medieval royalty and their food, we can't ignore one other fascinating aspect of royal eating: the influence of religion and the church on their diets. The church played a huge role in shaping what kings could eat, especially during times of fasting and religious observance. Let's take a look at how religious restrictions and beliefs shaped the food habits of medieval kings and their courts. As we continue our exploration of royal food, we come to a crucial influence on medieval diets: the church. The church was not just a religious institution in the medieval world, it was a political powerhouse that shaped nearly every aspect of daily life, including what kings and their courts could or could not eat. The church's control over the lives of the royal family was so extensive that it often dictated the rhythms of their diets, especially when it came to fasting and feast days. These religious practices were deeply intertwined with the monarchy's public image, health, and overall sense of power. Fasting was one of the most important elements of medieval life, not just for the common people, but especially for the kings and queens. The church had specific rules that required fasting at certain times of the year, and this became a fundamental part of the royal lifestyle. The idea behind fasting wasn't just to abstain from food. It was believed that doing so could purify the body and soul, protect the individual from sin, and help maintain divine favor. Kings and queens, like everyone else, were expected to follow these religious dictates, and their food choices often had to reflect the strict guidelines set by the church. But fasting wasn't just about abstinence, it was also about maintaining balance. The church didn't encourage complete starvation, but rather moderation. During fasting periods, kings would often eat simple meals such as bread, vegetables, and fish. These meals, which were much more modest than the lavish banquets of the non-fasting periods, were meant to demonstrate piety, self-discipline, and a recognition that the king was ultimately answerable to a higher power. During these times, meat was forbidden, and the royal kitchens would have to get creative with the types of food they could prepare without breaking the fasting rules. Fish became a staple during Lent, not just because it was allowed but because it was also considered a symbolic food, representing the sacrifice made by Jesus Christ. Now, imagine a king who had just indulged in an enormous feast, stuffed with the finest meats and rich delicacies. Fast forward to a time of religious fasting, and he's expected to turn down all those sumptuous dishes and instead eat bread and fish. It wasn't exactly the luxury meal he might have had a week earlier. And yet, this shift in diet was essential for maintaining the king's relationship with the church and, by extension, his relationship with his people. For a medieval monarch, following the fast was as much about image as it was about faith. The king had to appear humble and devout, even if he just indulged in the most extravagant meals on non-fasting days. Historians still debate how strictly monarchs adhered to these fasting rules. Was it merely a matter of public perception, or were the royal family truly following these religious regulations for spiritual reasons? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. Kings might have followed the letter of the law to some extent, but their personal indulgences often did not go unnoticed. The line between devotion and indulgence was often blurred, especially when it came to maintaining royal status. There were also special feast days in the church calendar, which allowed for more indulgence and relaxation of the fasting rules. These were days of celebration, where the king could once again indulge in grand banquets and offer lavish meals to his guests. Some of these feasts were held to commemorate saints' days, royal birthdays, or important military victories. While fasting periods served as a time of humility and reflection, the feast days were an opportunity for the king to flaunt his power and wealth. It was a delicate balance of piety and excess, and the king had to navigate both with skill. Interestingly, the religious influence on the royal diet also had implications for the types of food kings were encouraged to eat outside of the fasting periods. The church often endorsed foods that were seen as pure or sacred, such as certain types of bread, wine, and fruits. These foods were not just considered acceptable for consumption. They were seen as spiritually beneficial, imbued with divine favor. Wine in particular held a sacred place at the table. It wasn't just a beverage, it was a symbol of Christ's blood, a reminder of the divine connection between heaven and earth. Kings were encouraged to drink wine, but not just any wine. It had to be of the highest quality, often imported from distant lands, and it was consumed with reverence. In fact, some kings even used wine as a form of spiritual medicine. One king, for example, believed that the wine he drank on feast days could protect him from illness. If he were feeling under the weather or stressed, a glass of the finest wine was said to restore his strength and vitality. It's a curious blend of medieval health practices, religion, and luxury that seems to straddle the line between spiritual beliefs and physical indulgence. The church's influence on royal diets didn't end with fasting and feast days, though. It also extended to the general types of food considered appropriate for kings and queens. Foods that were associated with luxury, like rich meats, exotic spices, and sweet desserts, were often seen as indulgences that could lead to moral or spiritual downfall. The church wanted the royals to avoid excessiveness, and the church's advice on moderation often clashed with the decadent habits of the monarchy. However, as you can imagine, many kings found it hard to let go of their lavish feasts, and they would occasionally sneak indulgences into their meals. Historians still debate whether religious fasting had a major impact on the health of medieval kings. Was it the fasting or the feasting that ultimately led to their ailments? Was the church's influence truly beneficial, or did it contribute to a sense of imbalance in royal diets? What's clear is that the church's influence on food practices created a complex relationship between the royals' spiritual and physical needs. Next, let's dive into a more personal aspect of royal food culture: how kings used food as a political tool. It's not just about filling the stomach. For some monarchs, food was part of a grander strategy of power and control. From alliances to punishments, food played an important role in diplomacy and royal maneuvering. Stay tuned, we're about to uncover the political side of the royal banquet. As we move beyond the influence of religion, let's take a step into the more strategic realm of medieval dining, the use of food as a tool of power and politics. Kings and queens didn't just sit down for meals because they were hungry, they were often thinking about what those meals could do for them in terms of political alliances, strengthening their rule, or even punishing their enemies. Food at the royal table wasn't just nourishment, it was a form of diplomacy, control, and influence. One of the most fascinating aspects of royal feasts was how they were used to forge alliances. A king could invite another monarch or noble to a lavish banquet as a way of sealing a political agreement or ensuring loyalty. Food, in this sense, became a way to grease the wheels of diplomacy. Imagine a king preparing a feast for an enemy leader, offering dishes that were so extravagant and delicious that they couldn't refuse. The idea was simple. If you broke bread together and enjoyed an indulgent meal, you were less likely to break your promises later. The banquet became an unspoken agreement, one that ensured mutual respect, loyalty, and often collaboration in matters of war or governance. But it wasn't always about making friends. There was another darker side to royal dining. Food could be used as a tool of punishment or manipulation. In medieval times, food could be a way to subtly punish those who had fallen out of favor with the monarch. If a noble or courtier had offended the king, they might find themselves invited to a banquet where the food would be subtly altered to suit the king's agenda. Poisoning was one obvious method, but beyond that there were less direct forms of manipulation. For example, a king might invite an untrustworthy noble to a meal, only to serve them a dish that was deliberately unpleasant or difficult to eat. Perhaps the food would be cold, poorly prepared, or too spicy, making it clear that the king wasn't happy with them. Food could also be used to send a message to other courtiers, letting them know who was in favor and who was not. It was a passive-aggressive way to exert control over those around you, a reminder that your status at court depended on more than just your political alliances. It also depended on the king's appetite. Food could also serve as a reward. A king might give a particularly loyal servant or knight a special dish to show gratitude or acknowledge their service. These gifts of food weren't just about filling the stomach, they were symbols of favor, much like medals or titles. For the recipient, being treated to a special meal was a sign that their efforts had been recognized. And for the king, it was a way to reinforce loyalty and ensure that his allies remained devoted to him. In some cases, food became a form of communication, particularly when a king wanted to convey his feelings or desires. One famous instance of this was the relationship between King Henry VIII of England and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Henry, known for his extravagant feasts, often used food as a form of emotional expression. During one particularly tense moment in their marriage, Henry is said to have refused to eat a meal prepared by Anne, effectively sending a message that their relationship was on the rocks. Anne in turn interpreted this as a rejection, and the entire court felt the weight of the king's displeasure. And of course, food was also used as a form of punishment in the more extreme cases of royal behavior. Kings who were angry at their advisors, subjects, or even other royalty could use the royal kitchens as a tool for revenge. Some monarchs were known to intentionally humiliate their guests by serving them food that was beneath their status, forcing them to eat poor or substandard dishes as a sign of their diminished position at court. It was a psychological tactic, a way to strip someone of their dignity by making them eat food that didn't match their high rank or station. This type of manipulation wasn't reserved just for those outside the royal family. Even members of the royal household could find themselves at the mercy of a king who was displeased with them. The court, after all, was a very hierarchical society, and food was an important part of that structure. The finest food was reserved for the king, while the rest of the courtiers and servants had to make do with far less. What's fascinating is how food was such an integral part of these power dynamics, even in ways that seem subtle to us today. The idea that a king could communicate loyalty, discontent, or even outright disdain simply by what was served at a banquet shows the enormous weight that food carried in medieval society. It wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was about maintaining control, showing power, and keeping everyone in line. Historians still debate whether the use of food in this manner was as effective as it seemed. Was food truly a tool for manipulating alliances and punishments, or was it just a reflection of the king's personal taste and temperament? Some suggest that while food may have been part of the diplomatic process, the political power of these banquets was likely overstated. Yet, there's no denying that food played a crucial role in both social and political interactions within royal courts. As we continue, let's take a look at how these royal dining habits didn't just affect the political realm, they also took a toll on the king's bodies. While they feasted and dined like gods, the reality of their indulgence was starting to show. Obesity, illness, and other health problems became a major issue for many monarchs, and in some cases, these physical ailments began to affect their ability to rule effectively. As we've already seen, the lavish and often excessive eating habits of medieval kings weren't without consequence. While their feasts and banquets might have served as displays of power, diplomacy, and even punishment, the physical toll of such indulgence eventually became too great to ignore. The rich foods, the constant consumption of wine, and the sheer volume of fatty meats took a toll on the king's bodies in ways that were often as damaging as the political struggles they faced. These excesses weren't just a problem for the common folk. Royalty, too, had to contend with the health consequences of their own appetites. Let's start with obesity, perhaps the most obvious and common health issue that plagued many medieval monarchs. We've already touched on King Henry VIII, who, as he grew older, became notoriously obese. This wasn't just an issue of aesthetics. His weight, along with his lack of mobility and deteriorating health, had serious implications for his reign. Obesity made it difficult for him to perform the physical duties of a king, especially in terms of engaging in battle or traveling to distant parts of his kingdom. His expanding girth also contributed to chronic pain and gout, making even simple tasks difficult. Historians often debate whether Henry's obesity had a direct impact on his leadership or if his declining health was just the result of aging. Regardless, his health problems were a direct result of his indulgence in rich foods and excessive portions. The king's declining health was well known, and many courtiers feared that his physical decline would make him more vulnerable to manipulation by those around him. As his body became more and more debilitated, Henry's ability to rule effectively was compromised, which eventually led to instability in his court. For a monarch, losing physical strength and health could mean losing political power, and it's clear that Henry's indulgent diet contributed to his eventual downfall. But Henry wasn't alone. Many other medieval kings, including some of France's monarchs, faced similar health issues as a result of their overeating. King Louis XIV, for example, known for his opulent lifestyle, also struggled with obesity later in life. Like Henry, Louis enjoyed lavish feasts and was often surrounded by extravagant food. It was said that Louis enjoyed food not just as a means of sustenance but as a source of pleasure. And yet, his constant indulgence led to various ailments, including obesity and difficulty moving. By the end of his reign, Louis had become bedridden and unable to participate in the daily affairs of the kingdom as he once had. In both of these cases, their overindulgence in food led not just to physical health problems, but also to a weakening of their authority and ability to lead. Of course, obesity wasn't the only health problem that came from excessive eating. The high-fat, rich foods that were commonly consumed by royalty often led to conditions like gout, a form of arthritis that causes extreme pain and swelling in the joints. Gout was a common affliction among the wealthy and powerful, and many monarchs, including Henry VIII, suffered from it. The condition was exacerbated by the heavy consumption of rich foods, especially meats and alcohol, which increased uric acid levels in the body. In fact, gout was often referred to as the disease of kings, because of its association with excess and indulgence. Gout, much like obesity, affected a king's ability to lead. The pain and discomfort caused by the condition often left rulers bedridden or incapacitated for long periods of time, making it difficult for them to manage their kingdoms or participate in military campaigns. It's said that Henry VIII's bouts of gout led him to withdraw from important events, leaving his court to manage affairs in his absence. As his condition worsened, he became increasingly isolated, and his reign began to suffer. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political one. Kings who were unable to act because of their health were less likely to command respect from their subjects or maintain control over their rivals. Beyond obesity and gout, another health consequence of royal indulgence was digestive issues. Kings often consumed rich, heavy foods such as roasted meats, pastries, and buttery sauces, which put a strain on their digestive systems. Chronic indigestion, constipation, and other gastrointestinal problems were common in the royal courts. For some monarchs, this led to more serious complications, including food poisoning and intestinal issues. The constant consumption of exotic and rich foods, paired with a lack of proper hygiene and food preservation methods, meant that kings often faced the threat of foodborne illnesses. One of the more bizarre cases of royal food poisoning occurred with King John of England. In 1216 he was struck with a sudden illness after eating a surfeit of peaches and drinking wine. Some historians speculate that he might have eaten contaminated food, leading to his painful demise. Whatever the cause, King John's death highlighted the potential dangers of the medieval diet, and it served as a reminder that even the wealthiest and most powerful monarchs weren't immune to the risks of overindulgence. Despite these health challenges, some kings managed to break the cycle of overindulgence and recognized the need for moderation. King Richard II of England, for instance, was known to be health-conscious later in life, opting for simpler, healthier meals and focusing on his physical well-being. But for many monarchs, moderation was a difficult concept to grasp. The allure of feasts, the political necessity of entertaining, and the cultural emphasis on wealth and power made it hard to resist the temptation of excess. Historians still debate whether the health problems caused by indulgence were an inevitable consequence of the royal lifestyle or whether they were avoidable. Some suggest that the royal obsession with food and luxury was part of a broader cultural phenomenon that valued indulgence over moderation, while others argue that it was a reflection of the personal weaknesses of individual kings. But one thing is certain: the health consequences of excessive eating were a significant part of the medieval royal experience, shaping not only the lives of the kings but also the fate of their kingdoms. Next, we'll explore the decline of these extravagant eating habits, as kings began to shift toward more modern and practical diets in the Renaissance. What led to this shift, and how did it reflect the changing nature of power and wealth? As we move from the excesses of medieval feasts to a more practical approach to eating, we enter a period where royal dining habits began to evolve. The Renaissance brought about not only a flourishing of art, science, and philosophy but also a shift in the way that food was viewed by royalty. This shift wasn't just about dietary choices. It reflected a broader cultural transformation that was changing the nature of power, wealth, and the relationship between the monarchy and the people. One of the key factors in this transition was the gradual decline of the old medieval idea that more was better when it came to food. Throughout the medieval period, the sheer excess of food at royal banquets was a symbol of power and prestige. The more extravagant the feast, the greater the king's status. However, with the advent of the Renaissance, there was a growing understanding of the importance of balance in all aspects of life, including food. This was the beginning of a shift away from the gluttonous excesses of medieval feasts to a more refined approach to dining, where taste, moderation, and health began to take precedence. Kings and nobles in the Renaissance began to view food not just as a symbol of wealth and power but also as something that could enhance their personal well-being. This period saw the rise of more structured, well-balanced diets, and a greater awareness of the nutritional value of food. Kings began to favor lighter, simpler meals that focused on vegetables, grains, and lean meats, rather than the heavy, rich dishes that had been the hallmark of medieval feasts. The days of consuming entire roasted camels or peacock tongues were beginning to fade into history. At the same time, the Renaissance saw a renewed interest in classical ideas about health and wellness, inspired by ancient Greek and Roman philosophies. The idea of a balanced humoral system, which had influenced medieval medical practices, was now complemented by emerging ideas about dietetics and the importance of moderation. Renaissance thinkers like Paracelsus, who was a physician, alchemist, and philosopher, promoted the idea that food was a medicine, but that moderation was key. This philosophical shift reflected a deeper understanding that indulgence could have negative consequences for health. Kings who had once overindulged in the richest foods now began to turn their attention to more health-conscious diets, often focusing on simpler, more sustainable meals. The rise of Renaissance cuisine also coincided with a growing interest in culinary sophistication. Rather than simply overwhelming the senses with excess, royal kitchens began to experiment with delicate flavors and refined techniques. Dishes were prepared with an emphasis on balance and flavor, and new ingredients, including citrus fruits, sugar, and spices, became prized for their ability to enhance taste. Chefs, who had once been little more than servants in royal households, began to gain recognition for their skills in creating exquisite dishes that reflected the sophistication of their royal patrons. This evolution in royal eating habits didn't just reflect changing tastes, it was also a reflection of changing power dynamics. As monarchs became more aware of their health and well-being, they began to see themselves as caretakers of their own longevity, rather than simply powerful figures who could indulge in whatever pleasures they wished. In fact, the image of a king as a physical specimen, strong, fit, and capable of ruling for many years, became a more desirable ideal in the Renaissance. But it wasn't just the king who needed to be fit. The royal court and the kingdom at large were also beginning to view food as a reflection of the monarch's responsibility to their people. The shift toward more balanced eating was part of a broader movement in which monarchs began to focus more on their leadership abilities and long-term health, rather than short-term indulgence. A king who was constantly ill, overweight, or in pain was no longer seen as a strong ruler. By shifting to more balanced diets, they could appear more in control of their bodies, minds, and their kingdoms. Interestingly, the decline of excessive medieval feasts didn't mean that food lost its significance as a tool of power. Kings still used food to display wealth and power, but now the focus was on elegance and refinement rather than sheer volume. Instead of sprawling tables piled high with meat, nobles were now hosting intimate banquets, where fine wines, delicate pastries, and rare fruits were served in small, carefully portioned servings. The idea of a king indulging in excess was slowly replaced by the image of a king choosing wisely, both for himself and for his kingdom. By the end of the Renaissance, the extravagant, over-the-top royal feasts of the medieval period had become a thing of the past. Monarchs no longer saw their dining tables as platforms for power, but rather as a reflection of their own personal discipline and self-control. The era of indulgence was over, and the focus turned toward moderation, balance, and longevity. Kings no longer needed to prove their power through their meals. Instead, they proved it through their ability to live long, healthy lives and rule with wisdom and foresight. Historians still debate the exact reasons behind this shift in royal dining habits. Was it the result of a growing awareness of health, or was it a reflection of the changing nature of power in society? Regardless of the reason, it's clear that the Renaissance marked a turning point in the way that food was perceived by kings. The excesses of the medieval era gave way to a more refined approach to eating, one that prioritized health and longevity over indulgence. Next, we'll look at how these new attitudes toward food influenced not just royal families but the wider society as a whole. How did the shift from excess to moderation shape the diets of the people, and what lasting impact did it have on the food culture we recognize today? As the Renaissance ushered in a new age of moderation and refinement for royal dining, this transformation didn't just affect the monarchs themselves, it rippled through the broader society, influencing how people across Europe thought about food and health. The idea that food could be both pleasurable and nutritious, that indulgence wasn't always the best course, began to permeate the lives of nobility and commoners alike. The kings may have led the charge toward healthier, more balanced diets, but their choices and practices trickled down to the rest of the population, gradually changing the way society approached food. The shift from excess to moderation in royal dining helped lay the groundwork for the changing relationship between food and social status. In the past, food had been a display of power, with the wealthiest enjoying the richest, most extravagant meals. In the Renaissance, however, food began to take on a more practical and thoughtful role in the lives of both nobility and commoners. Kings and queens still dined lavishly, but their meals were less about excess and more about balance, delicacy, and taste. Nobles, seeing their monarchs embrace these more moderate practices, also began to value food for its quality rather than its quantity. At the same time, this period marked the emergence of the cookbook as a more widely accepted and even celebrated genre of literature. As royal kitchens became more sophisticated, chefs, who had once been seen merely as servants, gained recognition for their expertise. Royal chefs, many of whom were highly trained, became responsible not just for feeding the king but for curating sophisticated menus that balanced flavor and nutrition. As this culinary sophistication spread, it led to the publication of cookbooks that outlined proper ways to prepare food, making high-quality, moderate meals available to a broader audience. These cookbooks emphasized the importance of moderation and balance, offering a stark contrast to the earlier medieval tradition of feasting until one's stomach could no longer bear it. Food during this period became more accessible in a way that it hadn't been before. The growing focus on lighter, more nutritious meals and the increasing popularity of vegetables, grains, and fish made these foods more common even among the lower classes. While the nobility still had access to luxurious foods, commoners began to enjoy better diets as well, thanks to an increased variety of available produce and more sustainable farming practices. This shift in dietary habits was also influenced by the burgeoning global trade networks that brought new ingredients like spices, sugar, and exotic fruits into Europe. As these ingredients became more widely available, they began to be incorporated into everyday meals, helping to diversify diets and expand the flavors available to people from all walks of life. However, the Renaissance shift toward more balanced eating didn't mean that all forms of excess were eliminated. The royal court still held enormous feasts for special occasions, and large banquets continued to play a role in maintaining royal power. But instead of being daily events or routines, these extravagant meals became symbolic, reserved for times of celebration, diplomacy, or public display. A lavish feast still represented wealth and power, but it was no longer the norm for every meal. Instead, the meals that took place regularly within the court were more in line with the new Renaissance ideals of balance, sophistication, and health. Interestingly, the decline of the extravagant feasts also signaled a change in how power was projected in society. The kings who once demonstrated their might by consuming extravagant amounts of food now showcased their power in more subtle ways. Their ability to eat in moderation, to choose healthier foods, became a symbol of their ability to rule with wisdom and restraint. This shift reflected broader political and social changes. Kings and rulers began to view themselves as caretakers of the body and mind, not just as figures of power. They embraced the idea that being physically fit and mentally sharp was an essential part of good governance. A king who lived a long life and maintained a healthy body could rule effectively for decades, while one whose life was marred by illness and overindulgence might not be able to hold his kingdom together. The idea of moderation continued to spread throughout society. As the Renaissance period gave way to the early modern period, the focus on health and balance continued to gain momentum. Over time, people began to recognize the importance of food in their daily lives, not just as a tool for survival, but as an essential part of maintaining well-being. This cultural shift eventually paved the way for more modern food movements in the centuries to come, where dietary choices were not simply about luxury or survival, but about conscious decision-making in terms of health, ethics, and sustainability. Historians still debate the full extent of the Renaissance's impact on food culture. Was it solely the king's shift toward healthier eating that prompted this change in broader society, or was it a reflection of a larger cultural movement that embraced the idea of personal responsibility for one's health? Either way, it's clear that the Renaissance marked a turning point in how food was viewed, not just as a tool for indulgence, but as an essential element of life that required moderation, balance, and an understanding of its impact on both body and mind. As we close this chapter of royal eating habits, let's take a moment to reflect on how these practices, once centered on indulgence and excess, transformed into a culture of moderation and sophistication. The kings and queens who once filled their bellies with the finest meats, wines, and exotic dishes paved the way for a more balanced approach to food. And in doing so, they helped shape the food culture we recognize today, one where quality often triumphs over quantity, and where food is not just about filling the stomach but nourishing the body and soul. As we leave behind the grandeur of royal banquets and the excesses of medieval feasts, we now find ourselves standing at the crossroads of history, where food has evolved from an instrument of indulgence and power to a symbol of health, wisdom, and moderation. But even though kings and queens may have embraced more balanced diets, the shadows of the past, the extravagant, excessive feasts and the fears of poisoning, remained in the cultural consciousness of Europe for centuries to come. By the time the Enlightenment arrived in the 17th century, food had fully transformed from the indulgent banquets of the Middle Ages into a more refined art form. The court kitchens, once dominated by extravagant roasts and absurdly rich dishes, now saw chefs experimenting with lighter, more refined meals that reflected the growing appreciation for reason and restraint. The Enlightenment era, with its emphasis on knowledge, science, and practicality, had a lasting impact on how people thought about food, not just as something to satisfy hunger, but as a way to nourish both body and mind. This was the beginning of the modern food culture we know today. At the heart of this change was the shift in thinking about the human body. The Renaissance and Enlightenment periods brought about a new understanding of human anatomy, digestion, and nutrition. Kings, nobles, and philosophers alike began to recognize that what they ate could directly impact their health. No longer was food merely a tool for demonstrating wealth. It was seen as something that could affect one's vitality, longevity, and mental clarity. This evolving view of food paved the way for the more health-conscious and balanced approach to dining that would become widespread in the centuries following. Yet, despite the rise of moderation, excess never fully disappeared from the royal tables. Even in the 18th century, the spectacle of lavish banquets continued to be an essential part of royal life, especially when it came to formal events, political alliances, and diplomatic occasions. A feast was still a grand occasion where a king or queen could demonstrate their wealth, status, and power. But instead of the never-ending platters of roasted meats and sweets, these events became more sophisticated, with multiple courses designed to showcase culinary finesse rather than simple abundance. Royal chefs were now expected to create meals that were not only delicious but artistically presented, demonstrating the same attention to detail and refinement that was becoming a hallmark of the royal court. The extravagance of royal dining reached its peak with the reign of King Louis XVI of France. Under his rule, the French court at Versailles became known for its opulence and decadence, and while the menus may have been lighter and more varied than the feasts of medieval times, they were still extraordinary in their presentation and variety. At the same time, Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, were also a part of a broader social movement toward more refined dining practices. The French aristocracy had begun to embrace haute cuisine, a style of cooking that focused on lightness, flavor, and presentation, rather than simply filling the stomach. Historians still debate whether this shift in royal dining was primarily a reflection of changing cultural norms or a deliberate attempt to adapt to the economic and political pressures of the time. The 18th century saw the rise of a more secular aristocracy that had to navigate the demands of both the royal court and the increasingly powerful bourgeoisie. As the nobility struggled to maintain its wealth and power, the more extravagant, ostentatious feasts were often replaced by elegant meals designed to showcase refinement rather than excess. This was a time when food had become not just an experience for the body but also an expression of sophistication, taste, and social status. And yet, as the French Revolution loomed on the horizon, the very idea of extravagant royal feasts would soon be turned on its head. The revolutionaries who overthrew the monarchy in 1789 saw the lavishness of the royal court, especially its food culture, as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old order. The excesses of the monarchy, including the opulent feasts at Versailles, became a focal point for revolutionary anger. Ironically, it was in the aftermath of the revolution that the monarchy's approach to food was finally consumed by history, as the lavish banquets that had once been central to royal power were replaced by simpler, more egalitarian meals. The end of royal feasts symbolized the dramatic changes in European society, where food became a reflection of equality, sustainability, and practicality, values that would shape the future of European dining. As the centuries rolled on and the industrial age progressed, food would continue to evolve. The rise of modern agriculture, food preservation techniques, and mass production brought about a new era in which food became more accessible to the general public. The focus on refinement, balance, and moderation that had begun in royal courts during the Renaissance and Enlightenment continued to influence Western diets, shaping the way people thought about what they ate and why they ate it. The advent of global trade, the introduction of new ingredients, and the industrialization of food production eventually made it possible for people everywhere to experience a greater variety of foods, many of which were once reserved for royalty. Yet, the underlying principles of moderation and balance that had emerged in the courts of Europe centuries earlier would continue to shape modern food culture. We might not eat like medieval kings anymore, but the ideas about nutrition, balance, and the role of food in health that began with royal dining habits still resonate today. As we reflect on how royal dining habits have evolved, from excess to moderation, from the indulgent feasts of the past to the sophisticated meals of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, it's clear that food has always been more than just a source of nourishment. It has been a symbol of power, health, and culture. What kings ate, how they ate, and the impact of their dietary choices on their health and their reigns remind us that food has always played a central role in the story of human civilization. And as we look to the future, food will undoubtedly continue to be a reflection of our values, our health, and our connection to the world around us. As the Enlightenment ushered in new ideas about food and its role in health, society, and politics, these shifts didn't just remain within the courts of Europe. They began to pervade the broader culture in ways that would shape not only royal dining habits but the eating patterns of everyday people. The aristocratic feasts may have become more sophisticated, but the core ideas behind those meals, balance, moderation, and a focus on quality over quantity, slowly trickled down to the common folk. One of the biggest societal changes that came out of this shift was the growing recognition of food as a source of personal well-being, rather than just a symbol of social status. Kings and nobles weren't just eating for the spectacle anymore, they were eating to stay healthy and maintain their power. As the middle class began to grow and industrialization began to take hold, people started to realize that how they ate could impact their own health, just as it did for the monarchs of the past. The industrial age in the 19th century would continue to transform food culture, but in a very different way. The availability of new technology, refrigeration, mass production, and new farming methods allowed food to become more widely available, which led to an increase in both variety and accessibility. The focus, however, was now on efficiency. With the rise of the middle class, people could afford more food, but at the same time, there was less attention paid to the quality and balance of the meals. Interestingly, during this period the idea of health food became more mainstream. With the Industrial Revolution came urbanization, and with that, the rise of new health concerns. More and more people lived in cities and worked in factories, and with this came a decline in physical activity. The need for a healthier diet became more apparent as workers and families began to face the consequences of poor nutrition. Many of the new dietary guidelines that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were based on the same principles of balance and moderation that had originated in royal courts during the Renaissance. But, while royal courts embraced moderation as a way to maintain personal power and wellness, the growing middle class faced a different challenge: the increasing availability of mass-produced, often cheaper foods that were more about convenience than nutrition. This era saw the rise of processed foods, canned goods, and later fast food, all of which made eating more convenient but less healthy. The balance that once characterized royal meals was now being overshadowed by an overabundance of cheap, often unhealthy food options. What's fascinating, though, is that the principles of healthy eating that were once tied to the extravagant feasts of monarchs continue to influence the dietary habits of the public. The idea that food should nourish the body and mind, and that excess could have negative consequences, persisted even as new food trends emerged. As food became more mass-produced and industrialized, the debate over what constituted a healthy diet became more important than ever. This struggle between convenience and nutrition would go on to shape the food culture of the 20th and 21st centuries. One example of this shift can be seen in the rise of the slow food movement in the late 20th century, which sought to reclaim the focus on quality, local ingredients, and balanced meals, much like the Renaissance kings had once embraced. In reaction to the fast food culture and the processed food boom, people began to look back at the principles of moderation and balance that had been a hallmark of royal meals centuries ago. The idea that food should be prepared with care, using fresh and local ingredients, became a cultural movement in response to the industrialization of food. Ironically, it was in the modern world that many of the royal principles of dining, those once reserved for kings and queens, became a symbol of health, sustainability, and ethical eating. People were now paying attention to what they ate in a way that mirrored the dietary concerns of monarchs centuries ago. Food was once again viewed as a reflection of personal well-being, and the push toward healthier, more sustainable eating habits was seen as a way to counteract the negative impacts of processed, mass-produced food. Historians still debate the full impact of royal eating habits on modern food culture. Was the shift from indulgence to moderation in the courts a precursor to the modern movements for healthy eating, or was it simply a reflection of the changing times? Regardless of the answer, it's clear that the transformation in royal dining practices, from the excesses of the medieval banquets to the sophisticated meals of the Renaissance and beyond, played a crucial role in shaping how we view food today. The royal courts may have paved the way for many of the ideas we now associate with healthy, balanced diets, but it was the broader society, through industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of global trade, that truly brought these principles to the masses. Looking ahead, it's clear that the principles of moderation, balance, and quality over quantity will continue to influence the way we eat, not just as individuals but as a society. The way kings once used food to maintain their health and power serves as a reminder that the relationship between food, health, and power is far from new. In fact, the legacy of royal dining continues to shape our culture and the way we think about food, nutrition, and sustainability. As we stand at the crossroads of history, looking at how food evolved from the indulgent excesses of royal banquets to the more health-conscious, balanced approach of modern dining, we can't help but see how this shift in eating habits mirrors a broader societal transformation. The idea of food as not just nourishment but as a cultural symbol, representing power, health, and even morality, continues to play a key role in shaping our daily lives. And while the monarchy no longer holds the power it once did, the legacy of royal dining habits continues to influence the global food culture, from the way we eat to the foods we cherish. Interestingly, the royal courts were among the first to experiment with the concept of food as an art form. We've already seen how chefs, once mere servants, began to gain recognition in the Renaissance for their culinary expertise. But as food became more sophisticated, it also became a means of self-expression. The way food was prepared and served reflected not only the status and wealth of the monarch, but also their taste, personality, and the ideas they wanted to project to their court. The meals served at royal banquets became visual spectacles, and the presentation of food was often just as important as the taste. A dish could tell a story, reflect a political ideology, or demonstrate cultural prowess. The rise of haute cuisine, what we might think of today as French cuisine, with its emphasis on delicate flavors, artistic presentation, and culinary precision, can trace its roots back to these royal kitchens. In fact, the famous chefs of the French court during the reign of Louis XIV were pioneers of what we now call fine dining. As chefs were granted greater status and began to refine their craft, they turned food into a visual and sensory experience. This, in turn, trickled down through the ranks of the nobility and eventually to the bourgeoisie, influencing not only the culinary arts but also the culture of dining. Dining had become more than just a meal. It was an experience, a show of wealth, and a form of entertainment. However, it's essential to understand that this evolution wasn't just about aesthetics or pleasure. The idea of food as art began to align with broader philosophical ideas about beauty, harmony, and balance, principles that had their roots in classical antiquity and that were revived during the Renaissance. These ideas about balance and harmony in food were closely linked to the burgeoning interest in the human body and its well-being. The royals, with their access to the finest ingredients and culinary expertise, could afford to engage in this philosophical exploration, using food as a way to express and maintain their personal and political identity. But as the centuries passed and as food became more accessible to the broader population, this concept of food as both art and nourishment began to lose some of its exclusivity. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the rise of mass production and the industrialization of food made it possible for nearly everyone to experience a wider variety of foods. While the aristocracy still engaged in fine dining, the middle class increasingly began to adopt elements of royal dining culture, albeit in a more practical and budget-friendly manner. This democratization of food meant that the principles of balance and moderation that had once been exclusive to kings and queens were now shared by people across different classes and regions. This shift also led to a broader cultural change in how food was viewed. The idea that food could be a source of both pleasure and health became more widely accepted. The health-conscious eating that had been practiced in royal courts for centuries began to permeate society as a whole, albeit with a modern twist. New dietary guidelines, health movements, and wellness trends all began to draw on the principles of moderation, quality, and balance that had been so central to royal dining practices. It's fascinating to see how these royal habits, which once symbolized the epitome of luxury and power, evolved into something more egalitarian over time. The focus on fresh, seasonal ingredients, balanced meals, and culinary artistry that had once been limited to the monarchy gradually became part of the broader food culture. Today, many of the health-conscious principles that began in royal kitchens are now at the forefront of global food movements, from the rise of organic farming to the increasing popularity of plant-based diets. However, as we continue to reflect on the legacy of royal dining habits, it's important to note that the history of food is always a mirror of the broader society. The changes in how kings and queens ate, whether in response to health concerns, political pressures, or cultural shifts, parallel the ways that societies change and evolve. Food is never just about what we consume. It is a reflection of our values, our desires, and our sense of identity. The evolution from excess to moderation, from feasts of opulence to meals of balance, is more than just a story of kings and their appetites. It is a story of how food shapes and is shaped by the larger forces of culture, politics, and society. The royal table may no longer be the center of power, but the influence of royal dining habits continues to echo through modern food culture. As we look ahead, we might wonder how food will continue to evolve in the future. Will the principles of moderation and balance remain central to our diets, or will we continue to grapple with the effects of convenience and industrialization on our health? Just as royal dining habits once shifted to reflect changing political and social landscapes, our own relationship with food will undoubtedly evolve, influenced by new scientific discoveries, global trade, and emerging cultural norms. But for now, we can look back at the legacy of those medieval kings and Renaissance monarchs, whose feasts and dining habits were not just about food, but about power, culture, and identity. What they ate, how they ate, and why they ate the way they did shaped not only their lives but the trajectory of food culture for centuries to come. As we continue to explore the long-lasting effects of royal dining habits, it's essential to reflect on how the transition from medieval excess to Renaissance moderation not only changed the diets of monarchs but also shaped the culinary trends we see today. In fact, the legacy of royal dining is more than a historical curiosity. It continues to influence the ways we approach food, health, and culture. Let's rewind a bit and consider the deeper cultural implications of these shifts in royal food practices. As the monarchy moved away from extravagant feasts and toward more health-conscious, balanced eating, it began to reflect the evolving values of society itself. The Renaissance, a time of intellectual and cultural flourishing, coincided with a new understanding of the human body and the importance of moderation. Monarchs, who had once indulged in limitless feasts that symbolized their absolute power, began to embrace the idea that a king's health and vitality were just as important as their political power. This was a radical shift. Kings, who had previously been more concerned with demonstrating wealth and grandeur through lavish meals, now turned their attention to self-care. They recognized that to maintain power over their kingdoms, they needed to be in good health, both physically and mentally. The same principles that governed their political lives, control, balance, and moderation, now applied to their personal well-being, shaping how they ate and how they viewed food. This idea that food was connected to the soul, body, and mind was central to Renaissance thinking. Royal dining habits, which had once been based on excess, were now grounded in balance and the concept of food as medicine. Monarchs were becoming more attuned to the fact that what they consumed directly affected their mood, health, and even their ability to lead. The practice of moderation and choosing foods that promoted health was no longer just a personal choice. It was an essential aspect of being a responsible ruler. By taking care of their bodies, kings could ensure that their reigns were stable and effective. But the transition wasn't without resistance. As we've discussed, many monarchs continued to indulge in their favorite extravagant foods, even as the Renaissance ideals of moderation began to take hold. This tension between indulgence and restraint played out in royal kitchens across Europe. But over time, the values of balance and refinement won out. The extravagant, excessive meals of the medieval period gradually gave way to more delicate, balanced dishes that emphasized quality ingredients and refined techniques. As these royal dining habits evolved, so did the role of food in the broader social structure. What was once an exclusive privilege of the elite began to be disseminated to the general population. Kings who once feasted on rare birds and exotic meats now set the stage for culinary innovation that eventually spread beyond the palace walls. The skills of royal chefs began to trickle down to the bourgeoisie, creating a more diverse food culture that emphasized skill and creativity over sheer abundance. Fast forward to the 18th century, and the idea of food as an expression of culture and personal taste had solidified into the concept of haute cuisine. This was the dawn of modern French cuisine, where food wasn't just about eating, it was about creating a multi-sensory experience. The meals served at royal banquets had been transformed from excessive displays of power into sophisticated celebrations of flavor, texture, and artistry. And while the power dynamics of medieval banquets had revolved around grandiose feasts that were as much about spectacle as sustenance, the meals of the Enlightenment and later centuries focused more on creating a harmonious and aesthetically pleasing dining experience. But how does this legacy affect us today? The global food culture we experience in the 21st century can trace its roots back to these royal transformations. The focus on balance and moderation that began with the Renaissance still resonates in modern nutrition trends, from the Mediterranean diet to modern wellness movements. Kings who once dined on heavy meats and rich sauces were the pioneers of the idea that food should not only nourish the body but promote overall well-being. The concept of food as medicine, which emerged from royal kitchens, continues to inform how we think about the relationship between diet and health. The explosion of culinary creativity that took place in the royal courts has also laid the foundation for what we now know as fine dining and gastronomy. Chefs continue to experiment with flavors, textures, and plating techniques, just as the royal kitchens once did. The principles of elegance, balance, and refinement, which were developed in the halls of monarchs, now inform every aspect of haute cuisine. And as more people have access to high-quality ingredients, we can see the impact of royal food culture in the ever-growing food scene across the globe. Whether it's a Michelin-starred restaurant in Paris or a local bistro in Tokyo, the legacy of royal dining continues to shape the way we think about food as an art form. Perhaps one of the most important legacies of royal dining is its connection to cultural identity. Just as kings used food to express their wealth, power, and political stance, modern society uses food to reflect cultural heritage, personal values, and even political beliefs. The food we eat today, whether it's farm-to-table, organic, or fast food, says a lot about who we are, where we come from, and how we relate to the world around us. Looking ahead, food will continue to be an essential part of our cultural and personal lives. With growing concerns about sustainability, environmental impact, and the rise of plant-based eating, we're likely to see a return to some of the principles that defined royal eating habits: moderation, balance, and an emphasis on healthy, local ingredients. In many ways, the modern movement toward conscious eating mirrors the Renaissance-era transition toward more balanced diets. It's a fascinating cycle of history, where the dining habits of monarchs from centuries ago continue to inform the way we think about food in the present. In the end, the story of royal eating habits is not just a tale of feasts, food, and indulgence. It's a story of cultural transformation, power, health, and identity. From the lavish tables of medieval kings to the modern wellness movements of today, food has always been a reflection of who we are, how we see the world, and how we navigate the complex relationship between indulgence and self-control. And as we continue to explore food's role in our lives, we can look back at the history of royal dining to understand just how deeply food shapes our world. As we near the end of our journey through the fascinating world of royal dining habits, it's time to reflect on how these ancient eating practices, once confined to the halls of kings and queens, have reverberated through time to influence the way we eat today. The extravagance of medieval feasts, the refinement of Renaissance royal banquets, and the cultural transformations that followed have all contributed to the food culture we experience now. But beyond the dishes themselves, what's most compelling is how the power dynamics, social structures, and health concerns surrounding food have shaped our modern relationship with what's on our plates. In many ways, the transformation from the medieval to the Renaissance approach to eating was not just about changing menus, it was about redefining the very idea of what it meant to be a monarch. The kings who once feasted on whole roasted animals and rare delicacies began to see food as something more. It wasn't just about indulgence. It was about nourishing the body and maintaining the vitality necessary to rule. And this shift in mindset, toward balance, moderation, and health, had a profound impact not just on royal courts but on the society that watched and emulated them. We've already seen how the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods brought about a growing awareness of food's role in personal well-being. As monarchs and their courts embraced more balanced diets, the principles of moderation and the idea that food could be an expression of personal responsibility took hold. This idea was so revolutionary because, for the first time, food became more than just fuel or a symbol of power. It became a tool for longevity and effective leadership. The monarchs who embraced this shift weren't just making healthier choices for their bodies, they were sending a message to their people that a wise ruler takes care of himself, both physically and mentally. These ideas, of course, were not without their challenges. The shift away from indulgence in food wasn't easy, especially for monarchs accustomed to the lavish banquets of their predecessors. Yet, as the world evolved, so too did the role of food. No longer just a vehicle for excess, food became a tool for communicating power, grace, and moderation. And this cultural shift, born in royal kitchens, eventually permeated all levels of society, creating a more diverse and sophisticated approach to eating. As we look back on the legacy of royal food culture, we can see its influence in modern culinary movements. The rise of slow food, the popularity of organic ingredients, and the growing awareness of sustainable eating all reflect the same principles of balance and health that were once so central to the royal courts. Just as kings and queens had to navigate the complex relationship between indulgence and moderation, so too do we today as we contend with issues of health, sustainability, and the environmental impact of our food choices. What's particularly striking is how these royal dining habits, once exclusive to the elite, have become part of the global food culture. The focus on balance, quality, and nutrition that began with monarchs is now seen in the everyday choices of people across the world. The art of fine dining, born in royal courts, has now spread far beyond the palaces of Europe, influencing everything from street food vendors to five-star restaurants. The principles of health, moderation, and taste that guided the kings and queens of the past now guide the choices of modern chefs, nutritionists, and home cooks alike. And yet, even as food becomes more democratic, the echoes of royal indulgence still remain. In every lavish banquet, every meticulously prepared plate of food, there is a reflection of the royal courts that first saw dining as a powerful form of personal and political expression. The very idea that food is a reflection of one's power, status, and control over the body has endured. It's a theme that continues to shape how we view food today, not just as a means of survival, but as a reflection of culture, health, and identity. As we look forward, the story of royal food continues to unfold. In a world where food is both a personal choice and a global industry, we are constantly navigating the balance between indulgence and moderation, pleasure and health. Just as the monarchs of the past had to adapt to changing times, so too will we. But through it all, the principles of balance, quality, and conscious eating will continue to guide us, echoing the lessons of those ancient royal courts. Food, in the end, is more than just what we eat. It's a reflection of who we are, what we value, and how we view the world around us. The monarchs who once ruled through the excesses of their dining tables may be gone, but the legacy of their eating habits, their focus on moderation, their connection to health and power, and their influence on society, remains. As we continue to shape the future of food, we can look back at these royal tables, where the grand feasts of the past gave way to a more balanced, health-conscious approach to eating, and remember that the lessons learned from those meals still guide us today. As you reflect on this journey through history, consider how the choices you make about food, health, and sustainability reflect the same principles that shaped royal dining centuries ago. The future of food is in your hands. What will you choose to eat, and what does that say about you?